I, like many people the world over, love pirates, at least the stereotypical Caribbean pirates that we usually associate with piracy, which is what we're talking about today, because otherwise this video would be like 10 hours long. The swashbuckling, free, eccentric Robin Hood figures of the sea, thumbing their noses at authority and living a hedonistic life of adventure upon the open ocean. Their aesthetics are so appealing, from the cool pets to the camaraderie to the debauchery to the excitement, the thrill, and above all, the treasure and intrigue. But that's just an aesthetic, right? An exaggeration, a mythologized version of piracy of the high seas designed to sell an idea, in the same way that westerns and stories set in the Old West in general seek to whitewash and mythologize a very real historical period to fit a more acceptable and palatable framework. There's a reason you never see Clint Eastwood or John Wayne fucking brutalize Native Americans or condone slavery in old westerns, even though in reality the characters they played would have been doing exactly that. For hundreds of years, pirates ravaged the Caribbean Sea and caused massive harm to the established powers, stealing millions upon millions of dollars in today's money, hitting naval ships and merchant ships alike, becoming infamous for their brutality and, above all, their legend and fearsome reputation. The Black Flag for many represented a combination of freedom, fear, and rebellion, so much so that even now the legacy of those infamous pirates lives on, and we love this shit, from theme park rides to movies to video games to themed bars to fucking cereal mascots. Captain Crunch's best mate here has cut out men's tongues for disobedience and had many a man flogged or keelhauled for trying to keep treasure from him, and struck such fear into the hearts of those in power that even to this day, piracy of the high seas is one of the only 2 crimes still punishable by death in the UK, at least officially, along with high fucking treason. So how much about what we think we know about pirates is accurate? And is the refrain from a lot of people, especially on the left, that piracy is the highest, purest form of anarchy, really accurate? Would being a pirate be the optimal lifestyle for a modern anarchist? Honestly, entire books could be written about this subject, and in fact several have, so today, rather than focusing on any one topic in a huge amount of depth, I'm going to try and give as accurate and comprehensive an overview as possible. Let's discuss it, shall we? Yahara me hearties, 'tis Captain Disappointing Beard, here to tell you all about piracy of the high seas. Listen well, landlubbers, before you find yourself at the wrong end of a cutlass or ripped apart by grape shot. Stick with me and I'll see you right, lads and lasses. What is a pirate, you ask? Well,
I am not a pirate, but I long to be, sailing by the stars across the 7 seas, living with no earthly cares, my mates and me, the envy of a worldly men who are not free.
it's probably worth mentioning that a lot of what we know about pirates and piracy in general is probably based on a kernel of truth, but mostly just mythologizing and what we've picked up from popular culture. Like the parrot thing, that wasn't ever really a thing until Treasure Island was published in 1882, long after the golden age of piracy was over, and the West Country accent again wasn't a thing until the Treasure Island movie was released in 1950. Likewise, whilst some pirates did use walking the plank as a punishment, most of the time they actually preferred to use other methods, and walking the plank was extremely rare. Also, pirates rarely, if ever, buried their treasure. Usually their booty came in the form of commodities which they would then sell as soon as possible. Afterwards, an X never ever marked the spot. We'll go into more of these misconceptions throughout this video, but I just want to acknowledge before we continue that a lot of what we think we know about pirates is actually not the case, or at least is heavily exaggerated, in much the same kind of way we have with other mythologized people, groups and periods of history, like the Old West as I just mentioned, but also Vikings and ninjas. So before we really get into it, I must ask you to go into this with an open mind and be prepared to have your preconceptions questioned. So the first question we need to ask is, what's the correct term? What separates a privateer from a pirate or a buccaneer?
True friendship and adventure are what we can't live without.
And when you're a professional pirate,
that's what the job's about.
Nowadays, we tend to think of pirates, privateers, and buccaneers as essentially different words for the same basic concept, but in reality, they each have unique meanings, so let's go over that briefly, so we know what we're talking about. Don't get me wrong, they're very similar in that each of these terms describe people who attack and loot ships or settlements for booty, but the difference lies in the amount of societal acceptance they were afforded and just how legal their actions were. Buccaneers were a sort of cross between genuine privateers commissioned to defend the country's colonies and trade, and outright fight pirates. Privateers were sanctioned by their respective governments to raid enemy vessels. The colonization of the Atlantic saw many conflicts among the French, Spanish and English, so raiding by privateers was one way to gain an advantage. The captains of these ships were given letters of marque by their governments intended to validate all actions against the enemy, whereas pirates, real pirates, were those who acted on their own initiative and whims. They were very specific, unauthorized entities who worked outside the more socially accepted scenarios and did not discriminate when conducting their raids. The act of piracy was massively criminal and punishable by hanging as opposed to the other two, which of course were legal or at least existed in a sort of grey area. Henry Morgan was never going to be at risk of the hangman's noose, but Edward Teach absolutely was. There's a lot of overlap of course, but I just felt that we needed to clear that up before continuing.
We are born of the salt, we are children of sea. We don't bend our knees to no king or country, so we must lift our honor, the colours of free. And if we hit the gallows, that's the way that it must be.
I think one of the things that really resonates with me about pirates and the concept of piracy in general is what they represent, and inarguably a large part of that is freedom. In an honest service there is thin commons, low wages and hard labour. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. And who would not balance creditor on this side when all the hazard that is run for it at worst is only a sour look or two at choking? No, a merry life and a short one shall be my motto. The vast majority of pirates were not the vindictive monsters that often get portrayed in media or by people pushing back against the narrative of pirates being cool, but merely people escaping an oppressive system and striking back against it. There's a reason so many pirates were former sailors, and not just because they obviously had transferable skills and relevant skill sets, though obviously that helped, but because the empires of Britain and Spain, among others, as well as the institutions of early and precursor capitalism, like for example the East India Company, which we could go into a great amount of detail about because it's equal parts fascinating and horrifying, and maybe we will one day, but for now I just want to make the point that a large proportion of pirates were made up of deserters, cowards and rebels, who either had had enough of the abuses in the employ of their former masters, and remember that many Navy servicemen were press-ganged into the Navy, the same way as they were in almost all military branches, and wanted a better life free of oppression, which was basically just slavery, or were actively looking for a way to strike back. This wasn't the case all, or even a majority of the time. In fact, as previously mentioned, a lot of so-called pirates were actually government contractors known as privateers, hired by one empire to loot and burn ships belonging to another, but a lot were, and usually when we think of pirates we mean independent ships and crews, so that's what I'm focusing on today. Of course this was only true a minority of the time. In fact, most deserters from the British Navy actually went to join the fledgling American Navy due to the less harsh conditions, or else went into the employ of merchant ships or navies. In fact, the absorption of so many British deserters into the US Navy prompted a lot of conflict and arguably contributed significantly to the sparking of the War of 1812. However, a significant number of them were, and while some pirate captains were just as much, if not more, brutal than their native equivalents, in general the life of a pirate was more egalitarian and certainly more free from repression or violence born from strict hierarchy than that of a sailor in the Navy, though it carried a lot more risk should the ship be captured or you caught. The punishment for both piracy and desertion was hanging, after all. I really want to make it clear the sheer brutality of life on a naval ship at that time, because it's important to note the contrast between life on a naval ship and a life of piracy. Men working at sea had so much to endure. Cut off from normal life on shore for months, even years, they had to accept cramped conditions, disease, poor food and pay. Above all, they faced the daily dangers of sea and weather. A seaman's life was hard and he had to be tough to survive, so ship's officers kept strict discipline on board. In this way, they hoped to keep morale high and prevent mutiny. Seamen could be tarred and feathered, tied to a rope, swung overboard, and ducked or keel-hauled, dragged round the underneath of a ship. Flogging was the most common, with the whole crew often made to watch. A rope's end was used, or the infamous cat o' nine tails. A seaman found guilty of mutiny or murder would be hanged from the yardarm. The main rations were salt beef or pork, cheese, fish, ale, and some form of ship's biscuit. The quality of food deteriorated because of storage problems, lack of ventilation, and poor drainage. It was also affected by the presence of rats and other vermin on board. It was not always possible to fill ship's crews with volunteers, especially in wartime, so the law allowed gangs to seize men and force them to join a ship. Pressing peaked in the 18th century, but it was still going on as late as 1850. Seamen were often cold, cold and wet, rats carried disease, and a poor diet not only caused malnutrition, but specific illnesses such as scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C in the diet. As well as injury from shipboard accidents, there was a risk of death or maiming in times of battle. Ship surgeons worked in cramped and filthy conditions with no anesthetic, no infection, and gangrene was commonplace. Now, of course, some of these things were also present on certain pirate ships, though mostly to a lesser degree, but certainly not all, and of course many depended on the ship and the crew, as we'll later discuss. Further, as we'll go into when we cover the demographics and equalities inherent to piracy, it would be remiss for me to not mention that a lot of members of pirate crews at the time were made up of black sailors, primarily of African origin, escaping or avoiding the transatlantic slave trade, which was ongoing at the time. As W. Jeffrey Bolster put it in his 1997 book Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail, seafaring became one of the most common male occupations for Africans and African Americans in the early 19th century. Black sailors filled about 1/5 of the population at various sea havens. Becoming a pirate offered a choice of other occupations for African Americans that could improve their conditions. Africans and African Americans, both free and enslaved, were numerous and active on board pirate vessels. Some chose piracy because the only other option was slavery. Some black pirates were escaped slaves. Boarding a pirate vessel became a way to escape the Atlantic North undetected. Escaped slave Frederick Douglass disguised himself in sailor's garb and was able to travel undetected to the north and his freedom. As crewmen, blacks made up part of the pirate vanguard. They also worked the seafaring trades of shipbuilding, caulking, and sailmaking. Indeed, one of the most infamous pirates of all time was an African former slave named Black Caesar, who initially ran his own pirate crew but ended up joining Blackbeard upon the Queen Anne's Revenge as first mate, was there for his death, and was hanged along with the rest of the crew in Williamsburg in 1718. Fundamentally, piracy is based around freedom from and rebellion against an oppressive system, and I think we should admire and respect that, if nothing else. After all, the entire purpose of piracy was to attack and steal from abusers and colonizers, often in brutal and overzealous ways. It is for this reason that I feel pirates and their legacy resonates so much with me and others like me who dislike and feel a need to rebel and fight back against oppression. The British Empire may no longer exist, the American colonies may no longer exist, the transatlantic slave trade may no longer exist, the East India Company may no longer exist, but the things that they represented, oppressive Western colonial regimes, imperialism and capitalism, still do. So the symbol of the pirate is important and resonant. There's a reason pirate radio took that name and the Pirate Bay took both the name and iconography. Pirates are the ultimate outlaws, symbols of a dangerous, rebellious freedom, and I think that, if nothing else, is to be admired. 'Tis not enough to know what a pirate is in one of yonder books. To really understand, you must live as one of us. Learn our ways and customs, learn who we really are. You must take up a cutlass and sail with old Captain Disappointing Beard. Swab the decks, pull you weight, and above all, show us what you're made of when we pull up alongside a Spanish galleon. That's the true test of a pirate. None of this book-learning nonsense. If you can haul a rope and swing a sword, if you have a hankering for the freedom of the open sea, and a hunger for booty, both gold and soft variety, you're welcome aboard my ship. What does it really mean to be a pirate? Well,
we are dividing our plunder, everyone will get their share. When you sail across the sea, there's treasure everywhere. We are dividing our plunder, oppose us if you dare. We are pirates, and we are free.
One of the primary characteristics of piracy, especially in comparison to the merchant and imperial navies, was the concept of a share of treasure or booty, or to use more modern phraseology, wealth equality. Before we get into that though, I want to put into perspective just how much money a pirate could make and how valuable pirate treasure could be. It's widely believed by historians that on average a pirate could expect the equivalent of a year's wages as his share from each ship captured, while the most successful pirates would often each receive a share valued at around £1,000 or $1.17 million in today's money, at least once in their career. One of the larger amounts taken from a single ship was that by Captain Thomas Chew from an Indian merchantman in 1692. Each ordinary seaman on his ship received a share worth £3,000 or $3.5 million, with officers receiving proportionally larger amounts as per the agreed shares, with Chew himself receiving 2.5 shares. It is known that there were raids with multiple ships captured where a single share was worth almost double this. Likewise, after pirates captured a Portuguese East Indiaman in 1721, they divided the plunder between them. each man's share amounted to £4,000, around $7.5 million in today's money, plus 42 diamonds. A rather amusing story during this incident claimed that rather than receiving that many diamonds, one pirate got a large diamond judged to be equal in value to the smaller stones, at which point he thought he was being duped and taken for a fool, so he took a hammer to the large diamond, smashing it into smaller shards so he had more pieces. To put this into perspective, infamous pirate Bartholomew Roberts is estimated to have captured almost 500 ships during his piracy career. By contrast, a sailor in the Royal Navy received 19 shillings per month to be paid in a lump sum at the end of a tour of duty, which was around half the rate paid in the merchant navy. However, corrupt officers would often tax their crew's wage to supplement their own, and the Royal Navy was infamous for its reluctance to pay its sailors. From this wage, sixpence per month was deducted for the maintenance of the Greenwich Hospital, with similar amounts deducted for Chatham Chest, the chaplain and the surgeon. 6 months' pay was withheld to discourage desertion, which ironically enough probably caused more desertions due to the brutal conditions and prospect of a better life outside the law. Roughly half of all Navy crews were press ganged, basically kidnapped and forced onto a ship, a practice that was so common at the time that around 60,000 of the 120,000 of the participants in the Battle of Trafalgar were press ganged into service, and they not only received lower wages than volunteers, but were shackled whilst the vessel was docked and were never permitted to go ashore until released from service. Here's a chart breaking down the shares of booty various crew members could expect. As you can see, there's quite some variation, and some crews had positions others didn't, and so on and so forth, but for the most part, pirates were more egalitarian in this regard. We'll go into some of these roles and the pirate hierarchy on the ship later on, but even if we split it down to simple terms like captain, the professional managerial class, to use a term people who claim to be left-wing but who actually want to have an excuse to hate minorities use to describe people who don't want black LGBTQ plus people to die, and everyone else. Even here, the most the captain gets in comparison to his crew is double for the pirates, and as soon as we move across to the privateers, who are under the control of the government, usually that leaps up to quintuple, and the middle managers get a lot more too, but even that is tame in comparison to the Royal Navy, in which the captain receives 15 times more than the lowest paid crew member. Compare that to today's relationships between the wages of executives and workers, which on average CEOs earn almost 300 times the wages employees often receive, and whilst the Royal Navy's wage verticality has improved somewhat, the average captain in the Navy still earns 6 times the lowest ranking person on the ship.
I once met a lass so fine, she was drunk on barley wine. I'd been to sea for months or 3, I knew I could make her mine. And the lass was past consent, so it was off with her we went. And we threw her in bed and rested her head, and we left, 'cause that's what gentlemen do.
Pirates were, in general, extremely egalitarian in who got to join and even lead them. There's a lot of misleading media out there that claims that pirates were inherently misogynistic or racist or homophobic or whatever, and that definitely does have at least a grain of truth, because some pirates absolutely were bigoted, as was to be expected for people living in the 18th century, but this was heavily dependent on the captain and crew and varied wildly. Just as an example, the no women on board ship because they're bad luck aspect of pirate law that seems to have been carried down through the centuries wasn't by any stretch universal, and some crews actively welcomed, or at least allowed, women to join their ranks, as we'll get into shortly. I won't be including race in this section, by the way, because as we just established, people of colour, and especially black people, were far from a rarity aboard ship, and some even became captains in their own right, and I don't want to repeat myself. It's impossible to talk about piracy without talking about gender. Weird, I know, but hear me out. Some of the most infamous pirates of all time were female, and yes, women were a minority among most crews, but they certainly existed, like Pirate Queen Grace O'Malley, for example, though she operated slightly before the golden age of piracy we usually think of, or Cheng Yi Sao, a Chinese pirate who was the leader of a confederation of pirates that included a fleet of over 17,000 pirates and hundreds upon hundreds of ships when she was captured. But of course, we're mostly focusing on Caribbean piracy in the golden age of piracy, so let's talk about two of the most famous, though by no means only, examples of female pirates within that framework: Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both were ruthless, passionate and defiant, prone to often violent action, and crucially, pirate captains in their own right. It's widely speculated that the two of them were actually gay, or at the very least in a mixed throuple, but it's actually entirely possible that one or both of them were not in fact women at all, but trans men, given their preference for dressing and presenting as men, identifying as men for much of their time on board ships, and often going by male-sounding names. Of course, course, this is not confirmed anywhere, it's purely speculation, and it is perfectly plausible that they just felt more comfortable or that they would be better respected if they posed as men despite being cis women, but it wouldn't be out of the ordinary or unexpected for historians to erase queerness in historical figures, now would it? Sappho and her friend. Sappho and her friend. Sappho, for whom the term sapphic is derived, who lived on the island of Lesbos, from which the term lesbian is derived. What do you think she's doing down there? Oh, you know, probably just friendly stuff, right? Fuck me. Get it together, historians. As we just mentioned, it is speculated that Anne Bonny and Mary Read were in a bisexual polycule with Jack Rackham, and there is a great debate over their relationship, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, and there is quite a bit of potential supporting evidence. However, they weren't the only ones. So before we can really thoroughly understand the prevalence of LGBTQ+ people aboard pirate ships, first we need to understand the concept of matelotage, a custom practiced generally among seamen but particularly by pirates. Matelotage was a partnership between two shipmates that saw them share goods and wealth, and also involved survivors' benefits should one of them die. We don't really have any detailed specifics of how matelotage worked because there weren't written agreements, so there's very little in the way of surviving detailed records. However, it is often interpreted as a sort of proto-gay marriage or civil union between two male pirates. Robert Culliford and John Swan, for example, are often cited as an example of matelotage that closely resembled a gay relationship as we would recognise it today. Culliford was an English pirate active in the Caribbean in the late 1600s. Swan was his shipmate, and Culliford and Swan were partners by matelotage. There seems to be evidence of Culliford and Swan continuing to live together when not on ship, with some contemporary accounts indicating that the two men were in a relationship together. Likewise, Bartholomew Roberts, infamous pirate captain, is widely believed to have been gay, or at least on the LGBTQ+ spectrum, based on affection that Roberts showed to George Wilson, a young surgeon that Roberts and his crew encountered on their voyages, which was apparently something beyond a matelotage since Wilson wasn't a pirate. Roberts and Wilson were described as intimate and spent considerable private time together, leading to speculation. Most pirate ships were relatively accepting of LGBTQ+ people, and in fact, the Royal Navy's failure to do so was one of the reasons people deserted the Royal Navy in the first place and became pirates, as the punishment for homosexual behaviour on a naval ship was harsh and brutal. Don't get me wrong, some ships probably were pretty homophobic, but it's just a fact that songs like these are not actually based on much factual evidence and are certainly not representative of a majority of pirate ships.
They say they're
What say ye? We hoist the Jolly Roger, heel over to yonder Spanish galleon, lay a few broadsides again her timbers, swing over on these here lanyards with our cutlasses in our teeth, cut 'em to ribbons and split the booty. What say ye to that, me hearties, eh?
I don't like it.
You don't like it?
I don't like it, and I don't want to do it. It's tacky. Tacky. And don't look at me that way.
Well, if you don't like it, what do you want?
I want to sing and dance. I want to sing and dance. I want to be a pirate in the Pirates of Penzance. Wear me silver buckle slippers and me tight shiny pants. I want to sing and dance.
Pirates were surprisingly inclusive when it came to the disability of their crewmates. For a start, most pirate codes and ship's articles laid out really quite significant compensation for anyone injured in battle or during the voyage, some being the equivalent of a small fortune in today's money, and often these pirates would continue to serve. The image of the pirate with one eye, one hand and a wooden leg is actually not entirely unrealistic. A seasoned pirate would likely incur a lot of injuries for which they would be compensated, and often they were encouraged to stay on and continue life aboard ship. As Article 6 in the the pirate code of Captains Edward Lowe and George Lowther said, "He that shall have the misfortune to lose a limb in time of engagement shall have the sum of 600 pieces of eight and remain aboard for as long as he shall see fit." Bear in mind that one piece of eight is worth around $100 in today's money, meaning that a pirate will be compensated the equivalent of $60,000 for the loss of a limb and could still continue their piratical ways should they so choose. Some have compared this to a form of ill health and or liability insurance, which I guess may be accurate, though I'm not a huge fan of this comparison, to be honest.
Mutiny! Mutiny!
I hate to say it, but C.G. Piquet was wrong, at least partially. He got most of the broad strokes basically correct, but he oversimplified a lot of things, which makes sense. I mean, in total his pirate videos were like 10 minutes long, but in my opinion, in a couple of places, he did so at the explicit cost of portraying an inaccurate impression of reality. In this case, he implied that the basic hierarchy above a pirate ship essentially consisted of captain, quartermaster, and then crew, which I mean, isn't true. Don't get me wrong, we'll go over some of the things he got right, though he does generalise even these things, and seems to base almost all his information on Bartholomew Roberts primarily, which is fine, but Roberts' code was not universal, as we'll discuss in the next section. But he doesn't mention the gunner or many of the other onboard roles, just as a quick example, in a moment, but I wanted to just make it clear that a man on the internet was wrong, or at least misrepresented an idea whilst trying to simplify it, and that I noticed it, so please validate me.
You're a liar, and you will spend an eternity on this ship.
Let's just go over the most common roles aboard a ship and their responsibilities. Many roles on a ship were assigned by democratic means, especially the captain, who served entirely at the pleasure of the crew, who could easily mutiny and usurp them at any time. Most of the time it was accepted that whilst order was necessary, the captain's rule was only really to give orders during battle. Otherwise, they were deemed to be only worth following if there was consent among the crew. Likewise, most of the time a ship's code would be democratically agreed upon, and a ship's quartermaster often had as much if not more power than the ship's captain. Taking Stede Bonnet, famous 18th century pirate, as an example, who during his trial upon being apprehended downplayed his own authority, insisted that his crew engaged in piracy against his will, and said that he warned them that he would leave the crew unless they stopped robbing vessels. Now, this was probably bullshit concocted in an attempt to dodge the hangman's noose, and unsurprisingly, the court did not accept these protestations, though the boatswain, Ignatius Pell, did testify that Bonnet's quartermaster, Robert Tucker, had more power than Bonnet. So the idea of a rigid hierarchy aboard a pirate ship is quite simply not accurate. Though the captain held some authority and power, they usually only did so at the behest and consent of the crew, who were more than willing to and capable of deposing their captain and electing a new one. After all, a lot of the time pirate crews came about by crews aboard a navy ship mutinying, killing the captain and deciding to take the ship, living a life of piracy. Above a pirate ship there really truly was no legal repercussion for criminals killing each other, so the only thing that kept the authority of the captain in place was the loyalty he could inspire in the crew, mostly through competence and successful pirate raids. Likewise, the crew all agreed to the rules aboard a ship, so a captain doling out punishments for breaking them was merely enforcing them, and as all agreed to the rules, as well as the appropriate punishments for breaking them, there was usually very little pushback. Outside of battle, a captain's wishes could be overruled by majority vote amongst the crew, or in many cases vetoed by the quartermaster. In movies and video games, it looks piss easy, but in reality, firing a cannon was an extremely complicated and dangerous procedure, especially on a moving ship made of flammable material. It took precision and skill to perfect the placement of the shot, the correct amount of powder, the fuse, and the cannonball, and the cannon itself, and failure to operate one correctly could be disastrous. These things were filled with gunpowder, fired 12-pound shots, and ranged from 3,000 to 3,500 pounds each. As a result, each skilled gunner was a very valuable part of any pirate crew who didn't want to blow their own ship to bits. Master gunners were in charge of all the cannons, the gunpowder, the shot, and anything else that had to do with keeping the cannons in working order. Navigation is shit hard, especially when all you have to go on is the stars and maybe a compass. Since pirate ships often ranged far and wide in search of their prizes and sound navigation was crucial, if there was a skilled navigator aboard the prize ship, pirates would often kidnap them and force them to join their crew. Sailing charts were also extremely valuable and were confiscated as booty. A cooper was basically the barrel guy, in charge of maintaining supplies like food, water and other necessities of life at sea, and building more if necessary or if any booty captured was of a perishable nature. Existing storage barrels had to be regularly inspected to ensure they were sound, empty barrels were dismantled to make space in limited cargo areas, the cooper would reassemble them as needed should the ship stop to take on food, water and other supplies. The bosun was in charge of keeping the ship in shape for travel and battle, looking after the wood, canvas and ropes that were vital to swift and safe sailing. The bosun often led shore parties to restock supplies or find material for repairs when needed. He oversaw the activities such as dropping and weighing the anchor, setting the sails and making sure the deck was swabbed. Basically, the bosun was the middle manager of the main deck of the ship and made sure everything was clean and functional. After the captain, the quartermaster had the most authority aboard ship. Yes, I know in the movies it's the first mate, we'll get to that. They would be in charge of seeing that orders were carried out and handled the day-to-day operations of the ship. When there was plunder, the quartermaster was the one who would divide it up amongst the crew, according to the amount of shares each man agreed to receive, and as a result, also boarded prize vessels and determined what to take and what to leave behind. The carpenter, who generally answered to the bosun, was in charge of ensuring the ship's structural integrity and was tasked with fixing holes after combat, making repairs after a storm, keeping the masts and yard arms sound and functional, and knowing when the ship needed to be beached for maintenance or repairs. Due to the fact that fixing a pirate ship was difficult and inconvenient, having a carpenter aboard was essential if battle was going to take place. As pirates usually couldn't use official dry docks in ports for obvious reasons, ship's carpenters had to make do with whatever was at hand. They could often have to make repairs on a deserted island or stretch of beach using only what they could scavenge or cannibalize from other parts of the ship. Terrifyingly, ship's carpenters often doubled as surgeons, sawing off limbs that were wounded in battle, occasionally with a wood saw. Traditionally, a ship's mate, or otherwise known as first mate, ranked just below the captain and would take control of the ship if captain could not perform his duties any longer. A bit like vice president or deputy prime minister, I guess. However, pirate ships usually didn't have first mates unless they were really huge, too huge for a single captain to manage alone, which usually meant a fleet. Quartermasters mostly performed their duties on pirate vessels. Sorry, Mr. Smee is probably actually a quartermaster. Different pirate ships and captains had different sets of rules, as we just mentioned. Probably the most widely known about sets of rules was the Pirate Code, recorded by Captain Charles Johnson, regarding the articles of infamous privateer Bartholomew Roberts, which a lot of people seem to think was a set of universal rules, as in Pirates of the Caribbean, but there are also those of John Phillips, Edward Lowe and John Lowther, John Gow, Henry Morgan and others, each of which had unique rules but overlapped in certain areas.
Wait! Make good the clear for what? You have to take me to shore, according to the code of the Order of the Brethren.
First, your return to shore was not part of our negotiations nor our agreement, so I must do nothing. And secondly, you must be a pirate for the Pirate's Code to apply, and you're not. And thirdly, the code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
The Pirate Code wasn't some consistent law that all pirates abided by, and in fact many pirate codes clashed with one another, like for example Robert's Code specifically prohibited women being aboard the ship, whereas John Phillips' Code specifies that if at any time you meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle with her without her consent shall suffer present death, implying that the possibility of a female crew member or passenger was, if not common, at least not really all that out of the ordinary. If there had to be a rule set out for their protection, and as we've just discussed, it's not like there weren't female pirates or even female pirate captains. So let's discuss some of the commonalities. Bearing in mind, by the way, that pirate codes would usually be agreed upon by both the captain and crew before setting sail, and in the case of a crew mutinying and becoming pirates that way, those rules would have been democratically decided upon. Oh, and also most of the time the rules are simple and there are no more than around 10 to 15. For comparison, the overview of the Royal Navy Code of Conduct is 139 pages long and is made up of headings like Appendix 2 to Annex 21Q, responses to creditors who request assistance from commanding officers in the collection of debts. In short, the Pirate Code was not by any means universal, absolutely was not seen as a set of vague guidelines, and didn't include any kind of parlay rule.
Parlay? Damn to the depths whatever mutton they thought of parlay!
On a pirate ship, most decisions, outside of specific areas, were made by majority vote, and all rules were debated, agreed to, and decided upon based on unanimous agreement and input. They could vote for both captain and quartermaster, as mentioned, and likewise could demote them as they saw fit. Life aboard a pirate ship wasn't all that dissimilar to a modern worker co-op, or I guess commune, but you know, with more battles at sea, brief periods of ultraviolence, and scurvy. We've just discussed this, but the most important part of any pirate code is how shares are distributed, and generally they were shared as evenly as possible, with very slightly more for higher ranking pirates like the captain and quartermaster. Gambling was rife on pirate ships, partially because life at sea often involved long stretches of dullness and plain sailing, and also because they anticipated large amounts of booty, so felt that they could afford to gamble it. This often caused quarrels and enmity to be sown amongst the crew, as the loser would often attempt to exact revenge upon the winner. So as a result, to avoid this, since the crew would need to be united and trust one another during an engagement, gambling and games of dice were often not allowed within a ship's articles. This was fairly simple, but when you live on a ship made of wood with barrels of gunpowder hanging around below decks in case you need to attack and board a merchant ship, fire safety is pretty fucking important, so almost all pirate codes would include some variation on if you light a match or pipe below decks or near gunpowder, you will be brutally punished for endangering the ship and the crew. Sounds like a pretty catchy slogan, but basically no prey, no pay meant is that if an expedition didn't return any booty, then no pirate would receive a share, obviously, and also that anyone who refused to fight or take part in a fight would forfeit his share. This served to encourage increased risk-taking as pirates made a calculated decision to attack more valuable targets with a better risk-reward ratio, and also, if they wanted to be paid, would be forced to fight. In the event of a sea battle, weapons were important, and a poorly maintained sword or gun could make the difference between a victory or loss, so often harsh punishments were carried out for having poorly maintained equipment. As mentioned, with no prey, no pay, those who chose not to fight or attempted to desert a pirate crew before the expedition was over were looked down upon and received some of the harshest of punishments, mostly just death, but occasionally punishments like kill-hauling or marooning. As just mentioned with the gambling point, often pirates had serious and severe disputes amongst one another, especially regarding theft, since as the entire point of piracy was the equal distribution of booty, breaking of this covenant and defrauding crewmates was seen as a heinous crime and therefore carried harsh punishments. Likewise, quarrels between individual seamen often had an official method of resolution, as Bartholomew Roberts' pirate code claimed, no striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore, at sword and pistol. The quartermaster of the ship, when the parties will not come to any reconciliation, accompanies them on shore with what assistance he thinks proper, and turns the disputant back to back at so many paces distance. At the word of command, they turn and fire immediately, or else the piece is knocked out of their hands. If both miss, they come to the cutlasses, and then he is declared the winner who draws the first blood. Considering that a pirate's life often involved a lot of sea battles as well as sword fights, which often led to loss of limb, and pirates knew this, so often compensation for an injury was important to acknowledge and include, as mentioned in the previous section. So for example, John Phillips's pirate code included the following: if any man shall lose a joint in time of engagement, shall have 400 pieces of 8, if a limb, 800. Yes, look, okay, we've skirted around it a whole bunch, but fuck it, let's just acknowledge the, I don't know, parrot in the room. Pirates were, to a greater or lesser extent, overwhelmingly violent. Their symbols were that of skulls, swords, and crossbones. Their iconography that has lasted to today consists of cannons, cutlasses, and pistols. They're figures of freedom, yes, an alternative lifestyle for any sailor willing to take the risk, but they are also figures of fear. Yes, they struck back at those in power, but the way they did so was inevitably by killing sailors who a lot of the time as we mentioned, were press-ganged into service or were just trying to get by. To your average seaman in the 18th century, the sight of a black flag would not necessarily have been a hopeful sight, a chance to enact revenge on your masters or commanding officers, though that was definitely a possibility, as often during a pirate attack the pirates would stage a mock trial of the captain's treatment of his crew, and if the crew found him to be lacking, they would simply kill him, but often meant death or torture at the hands of pirates willing to do anything to get their hands on whatever precious cargo the ship may hold. Likewise, as we briefly mentioned, the concept of no prey no pay basically forced all pirates to be ready and willing to engage in incredible amounts of brutal violence at any time, since a coward or a man refusing to fight during a battle would receive no shares of the booty and sometimes received other punishments as well. And oh boy, pirates were imaginative when it came to punishment, especially if the sentence had been agreed upon by the crew. Let's just go over a few in brief, shall we, just to give you a bit of a taster, and remember that these were most often used against other pirates, but could also be used against enemy sailors if they chose. This was a popular tactic used on both victims of pirates' attacks and for fellow pirates that had fallen out of favour or broken various rules in the pirate's code, usually deserting or theft. Victims were typically deposited on remote islands where they stood little hope of surviving or being rescued. They were often allowed a pistol and one shot with which to commit suicide in preference to starvation or death from wild animals, as of course was portrayed in Pirates of the Caribbean. In some cases, the victim was simply pitched over the side of a moving ship and left for dead. Alternatively, they were towed by a rope behind the ship until they died from hypothermia and exhaustion. Contrary to popular belief, walking the plank as punishment was very rarely used despite its widespread notoriety, but it did happen. One of the only known accounts of walking the plank being used as a punishment featured the crew of a Dutch ship that was captured by pirates in 1829, in which pirates tied cannonballs to the victim's legs and then forced them to walk the plank and, of course, probably drown. A particularly nasty form of flogging was the infamous cat o' nine tails, a punishment that rarely led to death despite its extreme barbarity. The cat o' nine tails itself was usually an unwound rope whip of 9 strands, the ends of which varied. Sometimes the ends were tarred knots, sometimes fish hooks or musket balls, but usually some sort of particularly nasty thing. After the beating, the raw skin was sometimes covered with salt and vinegar to inflict additional pain and suffering. This one has a whole Ailstorm song about it, and basically meant that victims, often with lead weights secured to their legs, were tied to a rope hanging from the ship's mast's yardarm. The rope and the unfortunate subject were then subsequently tossed into the sea and dragged under the ship's keel on one side, and then brought up on the other side to the corresponding yardarm. Aside from drowning tortuously slowly, the victim was sure to be cut to ribbons by the inevitable scores of painfully sharp barnacles glued to the keel and hull of the ship. Victims were locked in wrist and leg irons and thrown into the ship's hold. Alternatively, they'd be held on the ship's deck or in the rigging where they'd be exposed to extreme weather conditions. In movies, clapping someone in irons usually meant that they were later going to escape 10 minutes later, though this usually didn't happen in real life. This involved the pirate crew poking and prodding the victim with cutlasses, swords, and various sharp instruments, whilst they tried to dodge the blows. This was made rather difficult as they were attached to the mast by a short rope. The victim's only option was to run or dance around the mast, all the time accompanied by the sound of the ship's fiddle. Pirates were not pacifists. They were often brutal, violent, and cruel. They tortured people until they revealed the location of their treasure, murdered and pillaged often totally innocent sailors, and yes, their methods were often less harsh than on naval or merchant ships. They certainly caused less damage and harm than the various European empires, and most of the time a pirate encounter didn't involve a battle because they relied almost entirely on their reputation and the implied threat that resistance would bring, though of course they did sometimes happen, and they were often merciless in their quest for loot. They did do a bit of torturing if they thought there was hidden booty, and they were brutal in the punishments carried out for breaking their codes. This is actually something CGP Grey summarised very well in his video, so I probably won't be bringing that up when I do get around to talking about him, and I will talk about him because his video gets a few things pretty badly wrong, but not in this video because I want to keep it as focused as possible. Look out for that coming soon, I guess.
Ha! These scurvy dogs know not how to deal with the pirate menace. For years they be trying to stamp down on us, crack down on us, and still they fail. And why does they fail? because as long as the sailors stewing with malcontent, broken over the wheel of British and Spanish Navy rule, flogged, abused, paid a pittance, working long hours, eating mouldy bread, treated like less of a man, there will always be those willing to raise the black flag. The more the Navy clamps down on us, the more they abuse their sailors, the more of us there will be. We'll make their lives a living hell. We'll take their gold, plunder their spices, and give nothing back. We'll give them so much hell, they're forced to beg us to stop with pardons. Even if they destroy Nassau, our beloved republic, we'll still be out there, out on the high seas, thieving their gold and living free.
There were various pirate-friendly towns and settlements throughout this period, Tortuga for example, but only one was ever an official, formal pirate republic, and that was the Pirate Republic of Nassau. The origins of this unique settlement began in 1696 when the privateer Henry Every brought his ship the Fancy, loaded with loot from plundering Indian trade ships, into Nassau harbour. Every bribed the governor, Nicholas Trott, with gold and silver, and with the Fancy itself, still loaded with 50 tons of elephant tusks and 100 barrels of gunpowder. This established Nassau as a base where pirates could operate safely, although various governors regularly made a show of suppressing piracy without a huge degree of sincerity. Over time, though the governors were still technically legally in charge, the pirates became increasingly powerful. The era of true pirate control occurred when a combined Franco-Spanish fleet attacked Nassau in 1703 and again in 1706. The island was effectively abandoned by many of its official settlers and left without any government presence. Nassau was then taken over by English privateers who became completely lawless pirates over time. Pirates established themselves in Nassau and essentially established their own republic with its own governors. By 1713, the War of Spanish Succession was over, but many British privateers were slow to get the news or reluctant to accept it, and so slipped into piracy. This led to large numbers of unemployed privateers making their way to New Providence, the official name for the settlement, to join the Republic and swell its numbers. The Republic was dominated by two famous pirates who were bitter rivals, Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings. The governor of Bermuda stated that there were over 1,000 pirates in Nassau at that time and that they outnumbered the mere 100 inhabitants. Blackbeard was later voted by the pirates of Nassau to be their magistrate, to be in command of their republic and enforce law and order as he saw fit. The pirate Thomas Barrow declared, "Blackbeard is governor of Providence and will make it a second Madagascar, and expects 500 or 600 men or more from Jamaica sloops to join in the settling of Providence and to make war on the French and the Spaniards. But for the English, they don't intend to meddle with them unless they are first attacked by them." While originally the pirates had avoided attacking British ships, this restraint disappeared over time, and at their height pirates could command a small fleet of ships that could take on the frigates of the Royal Navy. The amount of havoc caused by the pirates led to an outcry for their destruction, and finally King George I appointed Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas to bring the pirate republic to an end. In 1718, Rogers arrived in Nassau with a fleet of 7 ships, carrying a pardon for all those who turned themselves in and refrained from further piracy. Among those who accepted this offer was Benjamin Hornigold, and in a shrewd move, Rogers commissioned Hornigold to hunt down and capture those pirates who refused to surrender and accept the royal pardon. As a former privateer himself, Hornigold was well placed to understand what needed to be done, and he pursued his former comrades with zeal. Although pirates such as Charles Vane and Blackbeard evaded capture, Hornigold did take 10 pirates prisoner, and on the morning of the 12th of December 1718, 9 of them were executed. This act re-established British control and ended the Free Republic of Pirates. Outside of setups like this, and some pirate forts scattered throughout the Caribbean, there was very little in the way of large pirate collaborative efforts or formal organisational structure. While some pirates had entire fleets to their name, honestly these were mostly just loose conglomerations of various pirate crews or extension of one large crew under a single captain. Significantly more common was the willingness of pirates to simply work together on particular raids or larger operations, like for example the brief period in which Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard worked together, and of course the infamous Flying Gang operating out of Nassau. It is fascinating to think what might have been had the Pirate Republic been allowed to survive and continue, or if they'd not incurred the wrath of the British Crown to bear down upon them, and what it might have evolved into, but alas, it was not to be.
Yar har, fiddled indeed, being a pirate is a rented lead. Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
I hope this was at least a little informative. I've always been fascinated and intrigued by pirates, and this video was a very long time coming. I suppose you could say it was a labour of love, a true passion project, and now it's out there for you to enjoy, which I hope you do. In general, we have a lot of misconceptions about the golden age of piracy due to the mythologizing and fictionalizing of it in popular culture, in much the same way as we have with the Old West, the Middle Ages and ninjas. It's important to both enjoy the fantasies we create, but also acknowledge that they're not necessarily factual, and examine where and how our impression of real historical periods and figures differs from historical reality. Pirates were real, their lives were real, and their philosophy was real, but their parrots, planks, and shivered timbers probably weren't. The philosophy of piracy is nuanced and varied, but above all it prioritizes freedom, equality, and often harsh but fair treatment amongst their own, a burning hostility towards institutional power, and a disdain for rigid hierarchical systems that trap sailors in service to a repressive government or organization. Pirates seemed hedonistic, and maybe to an extent that's true, but they were also empathetic, and when they needed to, could be disciplined and efficient. Piracy was an egalitarian profession by and large, and there was certainly a lot of very good reasons for why it was so appealing to so many, even though the risks were so high. High risk, high reward, as they say. It would be ridiculous to try to claim that pirates were not prone to violence and cruelty, though it is important to acknowledge that this was often a last resort, and on the whole they were significantly less brutal than the imperial and merchant navies from which many of them originated. Plus, of course, the benefits of working on a pirate ship were significantly better than the prospect of working in a navy. There is very little in the way of evidence of large-scale pirate alliances, but it does seem that pirates were more willing and capable of working together, and there was very clearly a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect among pirates. Ultimately, piracy was focused on smaller-scale democratic councils and decision-making bodies with elected and easily unelected leadership roles, with positions requiring more expertise being rewarded, but not to an absurd degree. And so finally, we come to the end of the video, and I feel compelled to answer the question posed by the thumbnail. Were pirates anarchists? Well, it depends on your definition of the term, but there are similarities, and admittedly a very convincing argument could be made. The real answer though is that, in my opinion, it's unrealistic and unwise to attempt to apply modern political labels to figures from history. Like, would we call Mansa Musa a bourgeois capitalist? Would we refer to the grain dole of the Roman Empire an early form of government welfare? Usually only if we're historically illiterate or transparently trying to push a ridiculous agenda by misrepresenting historical figures and events. It makes for some great clickbait though. Oh, this is probably really cringe. But I spent like a tenner on like a child's dress up thing. So I thought, well, I have to fucking use it now. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a long time coming. I've been planning this one for a very long time, and it's probably the one that excited me the most. So I hope you had fun watching it. If you had anywhere near as much fun watching it as I had making it, then that's all I can ask really. Anyway, you know why we're here by now. The names on screen at the moment are those of my patrons who give me money each month to survive. So if you want your name to join them, feel free to donate $1 or more to me on Patreon, and in the next video that I work on after you do so, it'll appear in the credits. If you donate more than $5, you do get extra benefits, like you do get videos a couple of days early, and I do read out your name or username at the end of the credits as well. Allow me to demonstrate. So today, I'd especially like to thank Polite Pigeon, The General Line, Good Poon Hates Cops, that's Solid Poon then, Bryden Beck, Elise Jade, Calliope, Nanza Kambe, Chris Ragnacci, Theodore Pikelarov, Pixels Green, Emily. Next we have Ryan, Brian, Susie M, Thomas McCallum, and Tom Newport. Thanks so much for watching everyone. This was honestly a blast to make, and if it does well, I don't know, maybe I'll make another one in future, but thanks so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.